subject. So last night I went through some principles, just, randomly, kind of not necessarily in any order, on religious liberty as I've been studying this. And as I said, I'm not an expert on any of these things, but I'm beginning to see more and more that it's important not only for myself, but, as Seventh-day Adventists, and maybe I'm the last one on the boat, figuring this out, but I'm really enjoying studying more into it, and I really realize that it's a miracle that this country was ever established, and that you got 13 colonies together to agree on a constitution that even prior to that, several of those colonies, were not operating under those kind of principles. And it's just amazing that God raised up this country, and he did it for a purpose, and that wasn't so that we can be proud that we're from the U.S., but so that it would establish a place where a message could go to the world, and I thank God for him raising up the Adventist movement in this country. Now, tonight I want to talk a little bit more about religious liberty more in the context of 1888 more specifically. Last night I tried, one of the points I was trying to make in reading some of these stories or histories was to show that the National Sunday Law is kind of although it is the pinnacle, the image, it's the mark of the beast, it's not the only thing in the long train of that lamb-like beast or beast with lamb-like horns speaking like a dragon. That there have been times before, and even currently, where we are in our relation to other countries and other issues where that dragon is beginning to speak. So tonight I want to address just a little bit about in the context of 1888 history. So, and to start with, I want to mention a couple things here, and you'll understand why. And because I'm speaking to a small little 1888 group, I feel free to talk about this. My understanding, I'm glad Jerry's here. When Elder Wieland and Donald Short wrote 1888 Reexamined in 1950, it was not from a long-standing understanding of 1888. They had just been studying about it. And in that initial edition of 1888 Reexamined, you will not find the 10 points of the 1888 message. They're not found in that book. And it was only, years later, in the 1970s, early 80s, in 1987, when 1888 Reexamined was republished, then those 10 concepts were in that book. They were printed also in another book before that, the 1888 Message, I think, which was a couple of years before. But those 10 points were, I believe, as Elder Wieland and talking to Jerry Finneman, they were developed and studied out somewhat in the context of the Desmond Ford controversy in our church. And so I wouldn't say it was reactionary to that, but a lot of those 10 points were written out and thought through in the context of some of the challenges to the Adventist church through the Desmond Ford movement. And one of the 10 points, or you will not find among those 10 points any mention of religious liberty. Now, I never talked to Elder Wieland or heard him express negativity towards religious liberty or a denial that Jones and Wagner weren't they weren't involved in religious liberty, anything like that. But I do know I had a close friend I used to work with doing research and together. And he felt very strongly that religious liberty has nothing to do with the 1888 Message, and that's what Elder Wieland taught, to the point that in my Return of the Latter Rain, although I didn't really deal with religious liberty in any kind of extensive way at all, just mentioning the fact that Jones and Wagner, taught things on religious liberty, and this was part of that whole message that the Lord sent, was enough that we no longer have a friendship over that particular view. So in discussing religious liberty in the context of the 1888 Message, I, by all means, am not trying to stir up some kind of controversy on that, only that as I see it, and I'm not in any way speaking against Elder Whelan by bringing up the subject of religious liberty, only saying that I believe it's a point as a committee that it's a subject that may be even more relevant today to add to our list of 10 or whatever as pertinent subjects that go hand in hand with the gospel in addressing, some of the issues that not only we're dealing with today, but the issues that we will face in the future. And it most certainly was obviously an issue in the 1888 era. So that's why I'm just making those introductory remarks. I just want to make sure I have not, spoken to a lot of people about what do you think about religious liberty in the context of 1888, but I know there's some that have felt very strongly that it has nothing to do. So I'm not in any way, I'm not seeking controversy. I'm not trying to muddy waters. I'm in no way denigrating Elder Whelan by bringing this up or suggesting that it is a part of 1888 history. So just want you to have that in mind as we start. Now, normally I've talked about 1888 history, including the Minneapolis meetings, and gone into some details about the meeting, and then gone right into the revival meetings that happened in January soon after, and I love to talk about those revivals and how God worked, how he worked through young people. That's what's always so amazing to me. So this is an area that I've really never dwelt specifically on, especially in presentations. I mean, I've covered a time or two in the past, the Salamanca vision, that was years ago. But the areas that I've been studying too recently are new. And so, like I said, I may have to get up tomorrow and apologize or for something I say tonight, but which is okay. But tonight we're going to talk about a little bit about Jones and Wagner's involvement with religious liberty. And again, I'm watching the clock, so I know I'm not going to get through all the material I have, but we'll just go through here and then we'll stop and pray the Lord will bless us from what I've been able to cover. So normally I would give you a little bit of history of Jones and Wagner, how they came together. When I was at AFCO, I talked about this. It's amazing to me. You've all heard the stories. They never really sat down and studied together. And yet, one of them would go to the church one week, and another one would show up, preach at the same church the next week. And it's like, what did they talk about? Same thing you did. What were the verses they used? Same ones you did. What was their theme? Same ones that you had. So I think the Lord really did oftentimes, speak through them, not because they had studied together, but because in their own individual study, they had come to the same conclusions. So story begins tonight, 1886. I mentioned last night, same year, Adventism officially formed, 1863, National Reform Association formed. And immediately their objective was two things, a Sunday law and change the Constitution and put God into the Constitution. They felt that Jesus wasn't, represented enough and wasn't represented specifically in the Constitution. And they attempted that, the NRA attempted to do that on a federal level and never went anywhere. And so their work for the next 25 years, between 1863 and 1888, was to work at the state level. And that began to happen. They began to get state by state Sunday laws that were either on those original books from the colonial days reenacted or institute, new Sunday laws. And so even today, I think every state but one still has those Sunday laws on the books, and obviously they're not enforced. There was a federal law, interestingly enough, sometime in the 1890s that someone brought in to actually, if it had been voted, it would have deemed all the state Sunday laws as unconstitutional, which they are. And that it failed by one vote. And so, all those state Sunday laws are still there. But anyways, 1886, J.H. Wagner, the father of E.J. Wagner, out in Pacific Press, they started a magazine called the American Sentinel, and this is what we would call Liberty Magazine today. And I just want to, their opening article, January of 1886, this is their description of the purpose of why they started this magazine. So it is well known that there is large and influential association in the United States bearing the name of National Reform Association. While there are many people in the land who are opposed to or look with suspicion upon the movements of this party, there's no paper published in the United States which has for its distinct objective the vindication of the rights of American citizens, which we solemnly believe are threatened by the actions and aims of this association. Whoops, sorry. Continues on, and that light may be disseminated on this subject. We have commenced the publication of the American Sentinel. That such a paper as this is needed, we think we can make apparent to every individual who will read our paper, who will hold prejudice in abeyance, and examine our reasons with candor. So that was kind of their opening article. J.H. Wagner, wrote this as the reason why American Sentinel was started. And obviously, they would deal, with other issues besides just those that the NRA was involved in. At the back page of the 8-page paper in January, there was just this little, advertisement for the magazine. Obviously, this was repeated in the review and so forth. An 8-page monthly journal devoted to the defense of American institutions, the preservation of the United States Constitution as it is, so far as regards religion and religious tests, and the maintenance of human rights, both civil and religious. So that was the stated purpose of the American Sentinel, which began in 1886. Now, obviously, there was, even agitation, like I said, at this time at the state level. Various A.T. Jones was actually at a camp meeting, 1882, in Dayton, which is about 15 miles from where I live, Dayton, Washington, and they hired a cook to work for them during the camp meeting, and the cook came on Sunday and served meals, but because he was paid for his services, he was actually arrested and fined for violating the Washington Sunday law at that time. So there was a lot of things going on in the States. W.C. White was actually arrested in California for work or fined for work at the Pacific Press. He and one other editor, I can't remember which one it was. Anyways, end of December, 1 year later, and American Sentinel has 136,000 copies circulated just in that first year, which is really actually quite amazing. How quickly a little magazine out of Pacific Press went out. Now, this is at a time when there was, less than 30,000 Adventists. So 1 year later, December 1887, American Sentinel had reached a circulation had more than 255,000 copies by actual register have been printed and circulated in 1887, just in 1887. So I see God's hand in bringing the topic of religious liberty, to the front through this Adventist magazine, American Sentinel. Now, there's something else. Early 1888, or not early 1880, but in 1888, Ellen White was revising her 1888 or her Great Controversy. Now, as I mentioned last night, 1858 was when that Great Controversy vision that that we talk about she had, and that was written down over the next few years in Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, 2, 3. Over the next 6 years, and then that was expanded Spiritual Gifts. That was expanded into Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1 through 4. And the 1884 edition of the Great Controversy, that edition came out in 1884. And then Ellen White went to Europe, 1885. And while she's in Europe, she's walking and in the place of the very thing she's seen in vision. During Reformation times, and so she begins to write out more, and almost 100 pages were actually added just in those chapters. And here's W.C. White writing about that situation. At last, we are able to send you he's writing to C.H. Jones, manager of Pacific Press. We are able to send you the corrected copy for the first 4 chapters of Volume 4, and Volume 4 being the Great Controversy. Mother has written enough about Huss and Jerome to make 1 or 2 new chapters. She has written something about Zwingli. She may speak of Calvin. I think that the additions will swell the work 100 pages of its present size. And so that's, if you ever have compared the 84 edition to the 1888 edition, there's about over 100 pages of added material. And there's other minor changes, even like the chapter title, The Coming Conflict, in the 1884 edition, is now The Impending Conflict in that chapter in the 1888 edition. But W.C. White also mentioned something in this letter to C.H. Jones about this newest edition of the Great Controversy that's still in manuscript form. And this is what he says: please have Elder A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner give careful criticism to the corrections and to the whole matter. If they detect passages that are still obscure or anything that is apparently contradictory or conflicting with the Scripture, there may be time to communicate with us before any of the new edition is printed. Ask them to give particular attention to the note on the measure. And I'm not exactly sure what specifically that's about. But anyways, the point being that W.C. White had been directed, obviously Ellen White was involved in this, in sending a copy of the manuscript of the newest edition of 1888 edition of Great Controversy to Jones and Wagner to have them go through the material. And I'm still looking for an actual original copy of the 1888 edition of the Great Controversy, because in that edition there's 2 appendices in the back, about 6 or 8 pages each. And in correspondence with Tim Poyer at the White Estate, it can't be proved, but the idea is that those appendices in the 1880 edition were written by Jones and or Wagner in the appendices in the Great Controversy, and they dealt specifically with the events that were taking place at that very time. So obviously, as people are reading through the Great Controversy, in those particular sections, they're sent to the appendices where they can read more up on that particular matter. Now, just to show, I just ran across this other letter here just a couple weeks ago, which I hadn't seen before. And this is a letter from Ellen White a few years later where she's talking about this process, because I think some are, maybe uncomfortable with this aspect of the spirit of prophecy. And here she says, I have all my publications closely examined. I desire that nothing shall appear in print without careful investigation. I laid out all my manuscript on the Patriarchs and Prophets and on Volume 4, The Great Controversy, before the book committee for examination and criticism. I also placed these manuscripts in the hands of some of our ministers for examination. The more criticism of them, the better for the work. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole, I'm not capable of discussing prophetic guidance and all of its aspects, but the point I'm making it in here is in no way that Ellen White wasn't inspired or the book isn't inspired, but Ellen White did, in the process of all of this writing, have input in, grammatically speaking, as well as even in some of the areas of history and so forth. And Jones and Wagner happened to be at that list. And the only point I would make there is, obviously, even at that time, Ellen White, because of their writing on subjects like religious liberty and history and so forth, saw value in their assessment of the work. Another interesting thing is Patriarchs and Prophets, which it was Volume 1 of the Spirit of Prophecy set, and then Volume 1 of the Conflict of the Ages series. After Ellen White attended meetings in 1889-90 Ministerial Institute, where Wagner was presenting on the covenants, Ellen White added a chapter in Patriarchs and Prophets on the covenants, in dealing with the story of the children of Israel. And there was actually some, when some of the brethren read through the new edition and saw what she had written on that, they canceled their order because they were so opposed, to Wagner's, what Wagner had presented, and they felt like, again, that, Ellen White's being influenced, and so just a a side note there on patriarchs and prophets, which is mentioned here as well. Well, 1888, I mentioned yesterday the National Reform Association in 1863. By 1888, there was 4 groups now that had joined together that were now pushing for, changes in the Constitution as well as Sunday law issues. And this is how Charles Snow wrote it, Adventist, who wrote a book, 1914. This is what he says about it. He says, while in and that should be 63, there was one obscure organization advocating these un-American principles, in 1888 there were 4, and each of the 3 editions were capable of wielding a greater influence among the people at large than the parent organization. So in other words, by 1888, this slow-moving, what might have appeared somewhat slow, was gaining so much speed. By 1888, it was really coming to a head, and you had 4 organizations working together that had incredible influence in our country. So you can kind of see how all of this is peaking in 1888. And again, another reason why God would send a message to us as a people in preparation for this. And I'm not going to necessarily read through all these, but in May 21, the Blair Bill, the first one, was a bill to secure for the people the enjoyment of the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day. So this was a national law, was for the purpose to make the state laws complete and effective. So this was tied in with the state Sunday laws that had been being implemented. And just a few weeks later, May 25, or actually a few days later, he introduced a second bill, which was to establish the Christian religion as the religion of the nation, and this is exclusive of all other religion, and this would be through a constitutional amendment or a change in the Constitution. So all of that was brewing before the Minneapolis meeting. And of course, I've talked about this more fully, but I think God's intent, because God is a God of organization, was to send that message to us in a general conference setting, and then to go from there, to the churches and around the world. But now I want to just show some evidence I've been collecting. Just I probably read some of this before, but never stood out until recently. Just several examples of how I feel that actually religious liberty or liberty of conscience was part of the actual message that was presented in Minneapolis. And this is W.C. White. He's writing later, explaining to Dan Jones some of his experience before 1888. And he says, early in 1888, I began corresponding with Elder Butler, who was General Conference President, about an institute to precede the Minneapolis Conference. I proposed 4 or 5 lines of work, among which were the duties of church officers, new and advanced measures for carrying the message, the study of Bible doctrines, and then he lists in that list our religious liberty work, and 1 or 2 other lines which I cannot recall. What's interesting is he doesn't list here justification by faith as one of the topics. Now, I'm not disparaging him for that, but I'm just saying it's interesting to me that he remembers religious liberty as being on that list, and maybe that righteousness by faith fell under the Bible doctrines or something like that. So clearly, here's some evidence that this was even thought of even before Minneapolis. Now, this is DeWitt Hottel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this brother's name correctly, but he actually attended the conference, and he kept a diary, not a lot of detail, which is unfortunate. And this is just 2 little entries that he makes in his diary. He says, Elder A.T. Jones gave an excellent talk on national reform, and that was just under the date October 18, at the Minneapolis General Conference. And then the second entry says, Brother Jones spoke on national reform tonight, that was Sunday, for the October 28 entry, and that's all the information he gives. So at least we know from those 2 entries, though, that A.T. Jones actually must have done at least 2 talks on religious liberty at the General Conference. Now, DeWitt Hottel, in his diary, talks about how he got sick, and I think he was out for a week, so he obviously could have missed other meetings. So here's a book entitled Civil Government and Religion, or Christianity and the American Constitution by A.T. Jones. And I say I don't know where I've been the last 25 years, but I just happened to pull this out 2 months ago and read the preface. And this is what A.T. Jones says in the preface in February 1889. He says, this little work, and by the way, a little work to A.T. Jones is 168 pages.
When it says national reform, are you thinking he's speaking against the national movement?
He's speaking on the topic of national reform, of the national reform movement, And the reason I'm drawing a conclusion from evidence that comes later, where when he leaves Minneapolis, he's going to talk about that, and we have his published sermons, but that's kind of a short phrase that means this current Sunday law, religious liberty issue, yes, thank you.
The national reform movement
exactly
would be Sunday law, Christian nation.
The Blair Bills, basically,
Christian education.
Yes, everything, exactly, everything they were fighting for, good and bad, that's what he's addressing, yes. So, and you can find it in this book. This was his little work of 168 pages, is the outgrowth in February, which is only, February 13, 2.5 months later, of several lectures upon the relationship between religion and the civil power, delivered in Minneapolis, Minnesota in October of 1888. The interest manifested in the subject and numerous requests for the publication of the main points of the arguments presented have led to the issue of this pamphlet. So I just started reading through this, and I don't even feel close to being prepared to, talk about what he talked about, because, I read through the first few pages like, wow, those are thoughts I never thought of before. But he addresses, obviously, religious liberty issues and the issue of the whole national reform movement and so forth. Now, he expanded this book. I couldn't find a cover for the original edition, but he expands it twice. I think there's a 93 edition or a 92 edition, and then there's a 95 edition or something like that. The later edition is, I think, nearly 500 pages, so obviously other material has been added to it. But 2.5 months after Minneapolis, here's 168 pages based on talks, and he says several lectures. So I would say that's at least two, maybe, obviously probably more than 2 lectures that A.T. Jones gave at Minneapolis. So here's, this is something we've all read before, but again, a connection I never made. When he writes this in 1921, only 2 years before he passed away, someone wrote to him and asked him about the history. And he said, talking about after Minneapolis, he says, then when the camp meeting time came, 1889, we all 3 visited the camp meetings with the message of, and this is how Jones summarizes the message, righteousness by faith and religious liberty. And that's the camp meetings, which started soon in the early part of 1889. Sometimes all 3 of us, meaning Jones, Wagner, and Ellen White, being in the same meeting. This turned the tide with the people and apparently with most of the leading men. And then, of course, he goes on to describe more about, what happened. Now, here's a letter that, here's an article that G.I. Butler, who was unfortunately one of those that really had a hard time with Jones and Wagner, and notice how he summarizes in 1893, 4 years later, what that message was. And this is interesting. He says, I fully believe that God has blessed greatly to the good of his people and the cause, the greater agitation of the doctrines of justification by faith. So there's an acknowledgement there, even in his description, that obviously there was a agitation. The necessity of appropriating Christ's righteousness by faith in order to our salvation, and the civil and religious liberty principles now so much dwelt upon. So here's even G.I. Butler in this article in the review acknowledging or describing this message that has come into the church as justification by faith, and the topic of civil and religious liberty. So again, these are just, I've been beginning to collect these as I'm running across them. Obviously read them before, but just never associated them with, this topic of religious liberty. This is Ellen White. I know there's many. I'll just have one statement here where, she describes the message, obviously, many different times in many different ways, but this is one of them. And this is in the context of meetings that happened in Battle Creek after Minneapolis, just weeks after Minneapolis, even though she wrote this in February of '89. And usually when I talk about revivals, I jump over this and start in Massachusetts, South Lancaster, and have never really even looked so much at what happened in Battle Creek. So anyways, this is how she describes it. The revival services held during the week of prayer, and that would be in December 1888, and since that time have accomplished a good work in the Battle Creek Church. Elders A.T. Jones, J.O. Corliss, he was also a religious liberty worker, and others took an active part in conducting the meetings. The principal topic, now this is interesting, the principal topic dwelt upon was justification by faith. And this truth came as meat in due season to the people of God. And then there's one more sentence, and then this following one. The Holy Spirit, working through human agencies, revealed the deep significance of long-known truths relating to the new and startling movements in the development of the religious amendment to the Constitution. So that's, her way of describing principal topic, justification by faith, and that's seen in the context of this other aspect of liberty of conscience or religious liberty, or this movement that's taking place in the country. So, and there's many other statements. I took out some, and the Ellen White, how she blends those two as actually being part of the message. So again, this is just suggesting that indeed religious liberty was actually not only an afterthought topic, but it was actually part of the topics even talked about in Minneapolis. So taking the message to Battle Creek, and this last slide talked about a revival that took place, that's in December, or began. But what happened when they first arrived from Minneapolis? And W.C. White is writing here about the situation to J.H. Wagner, actually, who's back in California, and he's describing kind of what happened there in Battle Creek. The conference ended in Minneapolis on November 4, and then, of course, everyone that was heading to Battle Creek came back to Battle Creek. W.C. White was voted in as temporary General Conference president until O.A. Olson could return from Europe, and so that's why he was going back to Battle Creek. Probably hadn't planned on it, but he got back to Battle Creek, and this is what he says as he's writing it. So there are some who left the meeting, meaning Minneapolis, before it closed, carried high-colored reports to Battle Creek and other places of quite a discouraging character. Now, normally I would go through Minneapolis situation where W.C. White talks about that those who came, there was two groups, those that were blessed abundantly, and then those that were greatly troubled by the meetings at Minneapolis. So here he's saying some actually came back to Battle Creek and they gave some very discouraging reports. And then he says, our experience here in Battle Creek immediately after the conference, Minneapolis, was more interesting than edifying. Some who returned from the conference before it was done had given out that he, speaking of A.T. Jones, was a crank. And it seemed as though it would break their hearts to have the people think otherwise. Now, I don't know about you, but crank isn't exactly in my everyday vocabulary, so I looked it up in the 1828 dictionary. It's a person who has strange ideas or thinks too much about one thing, a person who is often angry or easily annoyed, or a twisting or turning in speech, or conceited. So I'm not sure what aspects he's referring to, but W.C. White described the response, at least by some, who come back to Battle Creek, who were describing A.T. Jones as a crank. This is how Ellen White talks about the same topic. She says, we found when we reached Battle Creek that some of our brethren and sisters had been preceding us with letters from the meeting of the same character that we had met at the Minneapolis meeting. There were also a number of delegates who returned to Battle Creek before us who were forward to make reports of the meetings at Minneapolis, giving their own incorrect version of the matter, which was unfavorable to Brethren A.T. Jones, E.J. Wagner, W.C. White, and myself, and the work I had been compelled to do at the meeting. She goes on, we found, no, there's just the reference at the bottom. Now there's something added to the aspect here that I had understood before, but it makes a lot more sense now. Before A.T. Jones had even come to the conference from California, he was a delegate from California along with E.J. Wagner, Battle Creek had requested that A.T. Jones come teach winter quarter in the college. History, I believe, history and Bible. And after the Minneapolis meetings in October, obviously he would return to Battle Creek and teach there. And after Minneapolis, they basically were going to rescind that request. So this is what W.C. White says about that. He says, you may know, and he's writing to his wife, and he's telling her, you may know something of the feelings that has existed towards A.T. Jones, and although he came east with the expectation of teaching in the college board had met, and finding that they had not taken any formal action about having A.T. Jones teach there, they voted to employ instead Uriah Smith and F.D. Starr to teach in the Bible course. So, and again, the reason I go over this, I'm not highlighting a negative picture of our history only for the purpose, I guess, of saying there was a struggle even over the topic of religious liberty. And ultimately, thankfully, through God's intervention and Ellen White's help, some of these things were able to change, which we will see. W.C. White continues in his letter to his wife, just at this time we were in a great strait for a man to go to Indiana, and as they had asked for Starr, F.D. Starr, the General Conference asked the college to let us have him, and we advised that they have a talk with Jones, and as he had come by our advice to work for them, Butler, Smith, and Prescott had a talk with him and have arranged on that he shall teach in the school during the winter term. So thankfully this was worked out, even though originally they had decided not to hire him because they had to take one of the other teachers they had officially voted on. They decided after all to let A.T. Jones teach there. But he had to sign a contract, which is interesting. And this now makes sense in this regard because Ellen White also talks about the situation. And she says, arrangements were made to shut A.T. Jones out of the school for fear that something should come that would be at variance with what has been taught in the school. Was this conscientiousness inspired by the Spirit of God? Certainly there was not the spirit of inspiration upon you from God, but from another source. And she's writing this to the brethren. Then she talks about what happened at Minneapolis. She says, when the resolution was urged upon the 1888 conference that nothing should be taught in the college contrary to what had been taught, I felt deeply, for I knew whomever framed that resolution was not aware of what he was doing. So sometime in the conference, at some point, obviously there was a discussion regarding the college and what could and could not be taught, and there was a resolution put forward, and Ellen White stood up against it. And it's in that context that she makes this statement. I stated that I was a stockholder in the college, and I could not let the resolution pass, that there was to be special light for God's people as they neared the closing scene of this earth's history. Another angel was to come from heaven with a message that the whole earth was to be lighted with his glory. And where's she quoting from there? Revelation 18. It would be impossible for us to state just how this additional light would come. Would it be right for every avenue should be closed in our school so that the students could not have the benefit of this light? Now, I always just assumed that this light was talking about, justification by faith. But in the context of what was going on here in Battle Creek, when Ellen White is writing about this, it included the topic, if not specifically about the national reform movement and religious liberty issues, and that will become a little more clear as we go into this next section. So they leave Minneapolis November 4 Sunday, November 5, Ellen White and W.C. White start heading back to Battle Creek. And that following Sabbath, November 10, Ellen White, having come back to Battle Creek after some time away, because she's come from California, she expects to be able to stand in the front and present a message to the church. And this is how she tells the story about this situation. Some of you are familiar with this. I was invited to speak the next Sabbath, November 10, in the tabernacle. But afterwards, because the impressions were so strong that I had changed, I think the brother felt a little sorry that he had asked me. 2 elders visited me on Sabbath morning from the Battle Creek Church, and I was asked by one what I was going to speak upon. Now, I find, the Lord, Ellen White was always very respectful. She loved, many of these rascals that she worked with. But, the times where she spoke the truth, and this was probably one of those times. She said, "Brethren, you leave that matter to the Lord and Sister White. Neither the Lord nor Sister White will need to be dictated by the brethren as to what subject she will bring before them. I'm at home in Battle Creek. On the ground we have broken through the strength of God, and we ask not permission to take the desk in the tabernacle. I take it as my rightful position accorded me of God." And that's the truth. That was her place as a messenger to this church, to speak on whatever matter the Lord laid on her heart, and she let that be known. But she doesn't stop there. She says, "But there is Brother Jones, who cannot feel as I do, and who will wait an invitation from you. You should do your duty in regard to this matter and open the way before him." The elders stated, that was what she said. Then the elders stated that they did not feel free to invite him to speak until they had consulted Brother Smith to know whether he would sanction it. For Elder Smith was older than they. I said, says Ellen White, "Then do it at once, for time is precious, and there is a message to come to this people, and the Lord requires you to open the way for the light to come to the people of God." And again, I've always assumed she's talking about justification by faith only. But she goes on. She describes this, by the way, this incident in many different places. She says, "But days passed, and there came no invitation for Elder Jones to present to the large church in Battle Creek the message given him of God. I sent for the elders of the church, and I asked again if they designed to give Elder Jones an opportunity to speak to the people. The answer was, I've consulted Brother Smith, and he has decided it would not be best to ask him because Jones took strong positions and he carried the subject of national reform too far. Not justification by faith, national reform too far. Well, you know what Ellen White had said before when she talked to them, maybe a week before, when they'd ask her, "What are you going to talk about?" Notice what she says to that response about, "Well, we don't think we should invite him because he's taken this issue too far. I then felt my spirit stirred within me, and I bore a very plain testimony to these brethren. I told them a little of how matters had been carried on at Minneapolis. and stated the position I had taken, that Pharisaism had been at work leavening the camp here at Battle Creek, and the Seventh-day Adventist churches were affected. But the Lord had given me a message, and with pen and voice I would work until this leaven was expelled and a new leaven was introduced, which was the grace of Christ. Here's another place where she describes the same story, gives a little more detail. She says, Brother Prescott, Amidon, and Cicely brought a united testimony on this matter, which called forth from me about a 15-minute talk as pointed and as earnest as I ever made in my life. So these were the three elders that she called for, and they came. Prescott was one of them. And it's interesting because after this issue in Battle Creek during the month of November, Prescott repented in tears. And a year later, he repented in tears. And a year later, he repented in tears in front of a whole student body. And a 10-hour testimony service followed in Battle Creek, 1892. That was actually 3 years later. Brother Prescott, came, and she gave a pointed talk she ever made. I answered, well, if Elder Smith takes that position, God will surely remove him out of the way, for God has not given him the authority to say what shall come into the tabernacle from our own people and what shall not. But if he holds that position, notice what she says, we will secure a hall in the city, and the words that God has given Brother Jones to speak, the people shall have them. She continues, another place telling the story. I then felt my spirit stirred within me. I bore a testimony to these brethren. I told them a little, and that is just repeating because that was the reference. Sorry, I went backwards. Almost back to where I was. Here's another place she talked about this. And by the way, I'll finish up here and summarize just a minute. I have had to fight, she's writing to Underwood, for every inch of ground that we have gained here at Battle Creek. The brethren were not going to ask Brother A.T. Jones to preach in the tabernacle. I felt deeply stirred with indignation at the persistent efforts to close the door to every ray of heaven's light. So I have no doubt after reading Ellen White's description, this was part of heaven's light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So W.C. White fills in some more details, writing to Mary again. He says, after we had been here about 2 weeks, Mother and I asked why they did not get him to speak in the tabernacle on national reform. Not righteousness by faith, national reform. Cicely said that he had asked Elder Smith, and he thought that Jones was rather extravagant in his expressions and took an extreme view. And he hardly thought it best to ask him to speak. Well, you can guess that when Mother had a chance to talk with Brethren Cicely and Abbott, and she told him her mind quite fully about the sort of planning, Amadon did not sympathize with the opposition, and he stirred around and he gave out an appointment for Sabbath and Sunday evening at the tabernacle. And so November 17 and 18, A.T. Jones was finally able to speak in the tabernacle. I don't know what he talked about on Sabbath night, but on Sunday night, A.T. Jones did real well. Again, W.C. White talking about it. Judge Graves, Ed Nichols, and other prominent citizens were there and were much pleased. The Dime Tabernacle set 3,300 people, and people from the community evidently were invited to this, and they came. John Fulton stirred around and he got orders for 1,500 copies of the journal if it had a full report, and then took his notes and Amadon's manuscript, and with A.T.'s help, they got up a fine report, which I trust you have seen ere this. And here's what W.C. White's talking about. The Battle Creek Daily Journal, the local magazine, or the local newspaper, reported the sermons, word for word, shorthand, in the newspaper. And this is how they introduce Jones's sermon for November 18, Sunday, November 18. The first of a series of lectures on our national constitution and religion and the state was delivered last Sunday night, November 18, in the Tabernacle by A.T. Jones, editor of American Sentinel, before a large audience, which the speaker held to an intense interest. And these were people from the community, not just the Adventists there. We are happy to present to our readers the following reports of the address, and then the publication was published. You will see by the review, says W.C. White, again reporting to C.H. Jones again, that it was arranged for A.T. to teach in the college. He is giving a course of lectures at the Tabernacle, which are being reported and very widely circulated. He and Mother attended the ministers' meeting at Pottersville, so W.C. White's bringing another incident. A.T. spoke 3 times and Mother 5 or 6. I should judge from what they said that there is quite a revolution in feeling and sentiment of the brethren attending that meeting. So, November 17, 18, he speaks at the Tabernacle. Then he goes with Ellen White for a week to Pottersville. That's somewhere in Michigan. You must be close to Battle Creek. Jones speaks 3 times there, and then he comes back to Battle Creek to continue his series at the Tabernacle. Sunday, December 2, he speaks again, and the local paper says this. Editor of Sentinel gave the second of his able series of discourses on the relation of religion to the state at the Tabernacle last Sunday evening, and then he spoke as follows, and they report his sermon. Again, dealing with religious liberty. Then on December 5, the third of the important series of discourses upon relation of religion to the state was delivered by A.T. Jones, editor of the American Sentinel, on Wednesday evening at the Tabernacle. The very large and deeply attentive audience which have attended these lectures are as indicative of the great interest taken in them by our citizens, and they are complimentary of the able and eloquent manner in which the subject has been presented. Mr. Jones, in his third lecture, spoke over 2 hours, holding his audience in breathless attention throughout. Now, I'm winding down here, so I don't have time. I don't even think I kept the slide. But when I contrast this description in the daily paper with some of the cynical comments made about Jones's preaching by some of our own people, it's very saddening. Well, I'm just going to refer you to these sermons that I would encourage you to read. December 8, Ellen White preached a sermon at the Tabernacle on religious liberty. And she really lays the matter out. She's basically asking, are we awake to what's going on in our country, 1888? And this is when Sunday laws were obviously being openly talked about. And here's would be a point to make. I'm concerned sometimes when I hear in my church today the idea that, when Sunday laws come, then that's when it will be time to, really stand up. And here's a situation, an example, from our past where Sunday laws were being openly talked about, and Ellen White herself is asking the people of Battle Creek area, are you awake? Why aren't you talking about these things? And why are you limiting those who are talking about them because you feel they've gone too far, too extreme? Anyways, I'm trying to get down to the bottom reference here where you can read this sermon. The title of the sermon is David's Prayer. It's Review and Herald, December 18, 1888. Sermon delivered December 8. And now I'm not going to read these slides. These are just references. She wrote to W.M. Healy on December 9, and she talked about, the church in Battle Creek is like the valley of dry bones. It needs to be revived. And I got to go back. Brother Jones obtained a hearing in Battle Creek, and many of our leading men were provoked after they heard him to think that there were those in responsible positions who would close the door to light and knowledge, keeping out just what was needed. So here's a situation where people had heard the rumors, that had come from Minneapolis, and they finally attend, that Jones is a crank, and they finally attend his meetings in the tabernacle, and they hear this message, and they're incensed that this attitude has been in place. The Battle Creek Daily Journal on December 11 reprinted Jones's sermons, all three of them in one printing, and 20,000 copies were purchased by the Review just to give out or to sell to people that were looking for them. Remember I said that in December 87, 55,000 copies of American Sentinel had gone out for the whole year of 1887. In the month of October 1888, I haven't even had a chance to go read what's in there, by December 11, 219,000 copies of that single edition had gone out. So I see this as, God doing something. But in January, it's reported that 25,000 copies a week are going out of the American Sentinel. That's the attention that's being drawn this thing. So here's another sermon I would recommend reading. It's where Ellen White actually, and I'm sorry this is so, it's called The Impending Conflict, and it's in December, special edition of Review and Herald Extra, December 11, 1888, called The Impending Conflict. And Ellen White is pleading with the people to accept this message, which isn't just justification by faith, it included religious liberty. Interesting enough, right in the middle of this, Jones goes to Washington to stand up and speak out against the Blair Bill, December 13, and then travels back to Battle Creek by December 15 to start a week of prayer. And this is where finally there was a breakthrough, as Jones was able to go through meetings there at the in the college, at the tabernacle, and at the Review and Herald offices. And Ellen White participated in different locations. There's another article I would encourage you to read, and that is an article by Ellen White in December 18 Review, and the title of that one is the whole article is about, December 18, and the title of the article is The American Sentinel and Its Mission. So the entire article, and again, here she's pleading with people of the church to make use of this instrument that God has shed light through, and very, very positive support. So I'm sorry I've run out of time here without even getting to the I guess, good part, which is the revival that did ensue in Battle Creek. But what's the takeaway? I guess the bottom line for me, as I've studied through this, is I realize that religious liberty is part of the gospel message, and it was actually a pertinent part of what was presented at Minneapolis. It was part of that message that was resisted by some. And I don't know what our individual take-home can be from that, but I think there's lessons that we can learn on this, as we can as well on the other history from Minneapolis. So I I would encourage you to read some of these articles that I mentioned, where obviously Ellen White is speaking inspired counsel that I think is still relevant for us for today. Father, we thank you for our history. Lord, I thank you that you have left us examples in the Bible that are for our admonition. I'm thankful that you've left examples in our history where we can beg of you to give us the blessing that others before us in positions of leadership and in positions in our church have done wonders with, and Lord, that we could follow that example, and Lord, that we would avoid the mistakes of the past in our own life. And we ask, Lord, that you'll guide us in the days we're living to address this gospel message as well as the liberty issues that will surely be seen on an ever daily basis in our lives. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.